Hey guys, this is Mr. Puddard here. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is the imperialism. Not just imperialism, but the new imperialism of the early 19th century and early 20th century. And it's different from the imperialism we studied before. But let's first look at the definition of imperialism. Imperialism is the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the economic, political, social life of the people of that nation. Now, this characterizes an entire part of European history, and it's closely connected to the industrialization process we just studied, because it was this industrialization process that gave them the power to be imperialistic against other countries. And our focus on this particular segment is going to be what this new imperialism is, and when did it occur. As you can see, most of it occurred in the late 1800s and in the early 19th century, early 20th century. It occurred predominantly from European nations. It occurred mainly by European nations. Now, early European imperialism was usually small colonies and whatnot, but this imperialism is different. So let's just take a look at first what countries were involved. Portugal, England, Spain, Italy, the Dutch, the Belgium. And it's also not included in that PowerPoint is a country outside of Europe, which is Japan. It occurred where in Africa, Asia, India. And it really occurred all across the world. Not only must we look at where it occurred, but why did it occur? And this is what makes it different from the previous forms of imperialism of Spain and Portugal, is that they're looking for basically for markets for finished goods. They're looking for markets as well as raw materials. They're looking, they use reasons such as nationalism and racism and national pride to justify this form of imperialism. So we're talking about a new form of imperialism that really we haven't seen before. Now look at how this happened. How did imperialism, how were they able to conquer the world? And predominantly it was industrialization. It was the invention of the machine gun. It was the invention of the steamship, the railroad. Places like other parts of the world were not quite as united as the Europeans were, and they took advantage of this, particularly in Africa and Asia. They played one party against the next. That's how a small country such as England can control 1/5 of the world, is by playing people off of them, each other, and also by this great amount of technological advancement that they did have. If you want to form a good visualization of imperialism, what you need to do is take a look at the picture of this giant octopus. And this giant octopus represents England. And what imperialism is a country taking its arms and spreading it all over the world, taking the parts from that world back that they need, such as the resources, and then leaving in that world other things, their capital, their goods, and their products that they want to sell, forever changing the nature of the people they are contacting. And if you look at that octopus with England in the middle of it, that is a great visualization of what imperialism is. It is an octopus spreading out from a single country, trying to grab hold of as many territories around as it can in order to control that territory, make that territory benefit the mother country, regardless of the subjects they are ruling. They do not care about local conditions. You do not care about local traditions, cultures, or nothing. The only thing when it comes to imperialism is controlling that piece of land and taking the resources out that you need to make your country strong and successful. Now, the causes for this new imperialism are many. There's economic causes. There's a search for new markets and for, new sources of raw material. There are social causes such as racism and the so-called white man's burden. Then there's political and military causes, the need for nationalism, the need to gain a military advantage over your adversary. And there's technological causes, which is basically advances in weaponry, advances in travel, such as the steamship and whatnot. The causes are multiple, and you can pause it and take notes from it. But What I'm going to do next is focus on a few specific causes that I want you to be aware of. So what you can do now, I want you to take this thing and I want you to press the pause button. And when you press the pause button, I want you to take notes from the list of causes there that you're looking at now. And then in a few seconds, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the specific reasons and causes that I want you to be the most familiar with. So let's address the first three motives for imperialism or causes for imperialism. First, we're going to talk about economic, and then we're going to talk about political, and then we're going to talk about cultural. And cultural, there are going to be two subtopics. One, the white man's burden, which was a poem, but it sort of came like the rallying cry for, or you should say justification for, imperialism, and then social Darwinism, which is basically the survival of the fittest oppressed in nation. And social Darwinism is heavily tied up into the with racism, and so it was used to justify that as well. And so we're going to dive into the first three here. And first, we're going to talk about the economic motivations, which basically the economic reasons are fairly simple: quest for raw materials or quest for markets. This is a direct response to the, or a direct effect, I should say, of the industrialized systems of the European countries. They needed places to sell their markets, their goods. They needed markets, they needed secure markets, and they needed to make sure they have access to these markets. And that's one of the main driving reasons for industrialization, is to get these access to these raw materials where the Europeans could nowhere else get them, make sure they had access and maintained access, and then take these raw materials out of that country, manufacture them in the home country, and then send them back to the colonized countries to be sold as finished goods, making it an economically profitable business for the colonizing countries, but for the subjugated people that were conquered, not so profitable or good. Now, the second reason we're going to take a look at is the political motivation for imperialism. And what we're talking about here is basically colonies were a symbol of power for Europeans. They would represent a political, basically, triumph. And this quest for colonies became a very, very hot point for many European powers. They created rivalries for the resources. They were competing for power, because how do you compete for power in early 20th century Europe and 19th century Europe? What you did is you got yourself some colonies. And these colonies would be economic viable to you. They would be militarily important to you. But politically, in late 19th, early 20th century Europe, they were vital. A country without a colony was a country that was not powerful. And so every country, major country in Europe, even the smaller ones like Belgium and Denmark, had themselves colonies because it was a status symbol. It was a symbol of political power as well as economic power. So we're leaving now the political reasons. Now let's move to the cultural. One of the cultural motivations or justifications for imperialism was something called social Darwinism. Darwinism became popular late in the 18th, 19th century and 20th century. And basically, Darwin came up with the theory of survival of the fittest. Now, what you see is this scientific theory that applied between species being applied to politics, being applied to people, and that's when the problem started to occur for imperialism. Social Darwinism basically dictated that you will have stronger nations and you will have weaker nations. And from the European perspective, the stronger nations were the Europeans. And from this, a great deal of racism flowed. And because Europeans were white and the places they colonized were not, and so they added a racist tone to their European Darwinism, because then it not only applied to social Darwinism, not only applied to the battle between countries, but now it applied to people. And you can see a lot of this in some of the current the cartoons on the video that you're coming through. You got one where you have the United States and the Englishman carrying the people there from their colonies up on the back of their backs. And this is a sign of them basically helping bring people up from below. And so it's interesting to note how people can take something intended to be for something else, literally, apply it to a different situation that was not intended to be applied in to justify what they do. An excellent example of the European attitude toward other peoples is a poem called The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden was written by The White Man's Burden was written by Kipling, and it's a poem that he apparently describes the burden of European people and Christian people to take care of basically lesser races and people of the other world, of other parts of the world. It reads, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captors' needs. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered yoke and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child." There's a lot of analogies you can pull out of that, especially there toward the end. Take a look at it, and see if you can, pull out what he is getting at from that. Because if you take that poem back, relate it to social Darwinism, and it clearly echoes the social Darwinistic theories that the strongest survive and that the other peoples need to bring up what they consider were the lower peoples. And this is, like I said before, one of the main aspects of imperialism, and one of the main justifications, this white man's burden, this burden on European peoples to go out there and pull up the rest of the world to their standard of living. And when they're doing this in regardless to local, they don't care what the local custom are, they don't care what the local people do. It was used as a justification as well as a reason for imperialism. Now, another reason for colonization was the need for military bases and a need to get places to refuel merchant ships. Basically, the more colonies you had, the more powerful you were. And so militarism and the need to have colonies for military purposes, not only for bases, but for strategic location of troops, for refueling stations for coal, for ships, was a very, very big push to have colonies. And plus, sometimes these colonizing nations would supplement their own armies with people from their colonies. And that way they would have larger armies, like in World War I, for instance. Many nations like England brought in troops from their colonies to help fight World War I in Europe. And so the military or militarism is one of the big pushes and reasons behind imperialism. And running hand in hand with militarism is something called nationalism. And this is basically excessive pride in one's own country. Each country thought it was superior to the others. And they thought that the stronger countries had the basically right to take over the weaker countries. Nationalism was really caught up with the whole thing of imperialism, because the more colonies you had, the more prestigious you were, the more bragging weights you had. Nationalism is not necessarily a bad thing, but taken overboard, it can be a dangerous thing. And this is what was happening with Europe at this time. Nationalism was growing. People were very prideful of their countries. They wanted to express this pride, and they usually did so through the possession of colonies. And so nationalism, this excessive pride in one country, is one of the also motivated factors for imperialism. Now, colonial rule came in two forms. There were direct rule, which is basic when you send officials and governors and soldiers to rule the colony directly. France did this a lot. And the other type is what Britain followed a great deal, was indirect rule. Sometimes they would use a puppet government, appoint a local ruler that they controlled. Other times they'll let companies like the East India Company control the colony, and the British government keep a more hands-off approach. They would support the colony militarily, but they'll let either the local person or the like the British East India Company rule the colony directly. And so indirect rule is when they would take a hands-off approach. A third party will rule under the government's control. Direct rule is when they would actually put governmental officials in, supported by an army, and they would rule directly. The government would rule directly, not through a third party. There are several different forms of imperialism. One was a colony. And a colony is like where you set a group of people in a foreign country or foreign land, and they run that little area like they would their homeland. Basically, with a colony, they are trying to remake the country in the shape of the mother country. You got protectorate, where a more powerful country will try to protect the try to protect a smaller country or weaker country. In actuality, they're actually being controlled by the outside power. You have a sphere of influence, where a outside power claims a specific control over a particular region, or such as trading privileges or investments in a particular region. That's a sphere of influence. They're not physically there. They say, we control this little area. We control this. That's a sphere of influence. And then you have economic imperialism, and that's where an independent but a less developed country is being controlled usually by a corporation, a business interest, something other than the government. An actual example of this actually is a U.S. company called Dole Fruit, and this company actually ran several Latin American countries. And so they are the different forms in how imperialism expresses itself. You need to be familiar with each. And they're each different. A protectorate gives say, a false appearance of an independent nation, but it's actually under control of a foreign power. A colony is where that foreign power is trying to create a new image of itself in a different land. A sphere of influence is where a foreign power says, I control this area. I control the economic privileges. I control the raw materials in it. So this is my sphere of influence, my bubble. You can't touch. And then finally you got the economic imperialism, where not necessarily done by a country, usually done by a company that is usually supported by the country, and they basically, this third party, this company, runs the country. Finally, let's address the issue of Europe and Latin America. Really, there was no European imperialism in Latin America for four predominant reasons. First, they were pretty much extended in Europe, overextended. There's no need to, because they already had economic trade cooperation. Latin America has also proven to be effective at resisting European rule. And finally, and more importantly, the United States had already claimed complete control over Latin America. And so for these reasons, we really don't see any imperialism in South America during this time period. In summary, guys, we have given you the reasons for imperialism, the justification for imperialism, some of the type of the rules for imperialism, how they ruled, I should say, for imperialism, and the forms of imperialism. You need to know these things, guys. Use your guiding questions, answer the questions, and I'll see you on Thursday. Take care.